Welcome to the next podcast, where we look at the wealth management firm of the future and all the things that are expected to drive growth and success in the wealth management industry over the next 5 to 10 years. I'm Mark Bruno, the managing director of the Wealth Management Group at Informa Connect, and I am thrilled to have one of my favorite people in this industry on our podcast today. Carina Diamond, the Chief Growth Officer at Dakota Wealth Management, is joining us here today. Carina, thanks so much for being the first podcast interview of 2023.
I'm very honored, Mark.
It's great to have you stop by again. I know we've had you on other podcasts on the Wealth Management Team, Wealth Stack podcast last year, but it was a great discussion, and we really wanted to have you back to talk about the wealth management firm of the future, and more specifically, a lot of the things that we're seeing around people, human capital, and how some of the fastest growing firms in our industry are evolving. We've done a lot of work on this next project over the last 6 to 9 months. We've done a tremendous amount of research trying to understand what's driving growth and success, but more importantly, what will drive growth and success over the next 5 to 10 years. And we've seen a lot of the fastest growing firms are putting human capital at the top of the list. They're thinking about how do they optimize their organizational design and their structure so that it does actually align with where there are the most growth opportunities and the most client needs. I know Dakota is one of the fastest growing firms in our industry, but I also know that you're very strategic in the way you think about organizational design and structure, roles, skill sets, and all the things that you need to be one of the most successful firms in the industry. And with that, I couldn't think of a better place to start. You're in a relatively new role, or at least you have a relatively new title. Carina, maybe before we dive into the wealth management firm of the future, could you offer a little bit of context on your role as Chief Growth Officer at Dakota, what you're focused on, and what the goal is?
So happy to, Mark. So I'm a big believer that when you're in leadership, that you always have to be thinking about having the right people in the right seats at the right time. And so at Dakota, we're not afraid to change the deck chairs a little bit, adjust roles as expectations change, especially when we're experiencing such rapid growth. We've roughly tripled in the last couple of years. So when I joined the firm 3.5 years ago, I was the Chief Experience Officer, which was a title that I made up, which was very focused on the client experience. Okay. I like to make things up, and I like X. So Experience Officer was kind of cool. And it was a perfect role going through the pandemic and managing communications with clients, and then also keeping staff in their seats. But as things evolved, it became obvious that we needed to continue our focus on organic growth as well as inorganic growth, which we do a lot of. So I morphed into the Chief Growth Officer role effectively in September. And what I do is I oversee all the advisors at the firm and working with their individual growth plans in their different geographic areas. A part of what I do is connect people with the right resources. So I do a lot of troubleshooting, and I do a lot of connecting with technology, with compliance, with investments, that sort of thing.
Excellent. It's a great place to start, because I think, having done a number of interviews with really large firms over the last year, some of the largest firms, those that are over, say, 3 billion in assets or so, and definitely over 10 billion. I'm starting to see this title of Chief Growth Officer become more and more popular. And in fact, if I were to probably isolate, the largest firms in the industry, it seems like the majority of them have somebody in a role where they're focused on growth, and not just M&A and not just organic growth, right? But the combination of the two. So fantastic starting point for our conversation that we have here. So big picture, when we think about how the wealth management industry will evolve, and let's look at the next decade or so. I know it's a lot that could happen, right? But we've been saying for quite some time now that while we're in a bear market, it really is truly a bull market for advice. I personally believe that people need financial advice now more than ever for a wide range of reasons. But I'm curious to get your sense. One, how do you think that existing client and new client needs will continue to evolve? And then two, what specific challenges and opportunities does this actually present to wealth managers who are looking to grow?
So I think there's a real similarity between what the clients need and then also what the teams of people who work at the RIAs need. Because going through the pandemic, a number of trends, I think, were accelerated tenfold. So whether it's your employees, your team, your shareholders, or whether it's your clients, I think people have radically changed their priorities. And I think we have more and more people that instead of living to work, like I probably still do, I think more and more clients and employees or shareholders really are working to live. And that has huge implications for the advice business. And it also has huge implications for how advice is then delivered to the clients. I think another huge change is the whole diversity and inclusion space, which is really also reshaping wealth management. And I think what's happening is a couple things. I think getting investment advice and wealth management advice is now being normalized for many, many more groups of people than it was even 5 years ago. And that in turn has implications. Again, it's all kind of a circle. It has implications then for who's working at these wealth management firms. Hey, I want an advisor that looks more like me. And then it's all connected. And I think they're all kind of part of the same trend, Mark.
Yeah, it's interesting. We had a couple of think tanks that we hosted last year. You participated in the first, where we were looking at diversity and inclusion and how client needs were aligning with some growth opportunities. And in one of the think tanks, the one we did in September, it was interesting, the comment that, finance and wealth has become cool, right? With some younger investors has really stuck with me. I know it sounds so simple and so basic, but you just look at over the last year to two, right? Learning and understanding and being a good DIY investor has been, quote, cool. So in my mind, obviously there's a lot of education that still needs to happen and be transferred, but that does open the door for more people to learn about advice, right? And for more people to seek out professional advice, particularly as their lives become more complex and people get a little bit older. And I guess that leads right into my next question. I mean, as you look at the future, how do you think the role of a financial advisor will change? And more specifically, how do you think that will align with client dynamics and client needs?
So I think the role of the financial advisor is going to continue to become more and more holistic. So the days of having, a stock guy or an insurance gal, those are kind of in the rearview mirror, because clients really often want one point of contact. And that point of contact may refer other professionals. And that's, something that also outlines the importance of having networks. So you can't just be in your little bubble. You've got to make sure you're surrounding yourself with professionals that can be of assistance. But I think the role is going to become more and more of a sort of a coordinator, a quarterback with different generations of families. I know my clients probably value me most because I'm a problem solver. And I think the role of the advisor is also going to become less and less investment centric, and more of an idea generator, more of a protector in some ways, more of a counselor maybe. I think the rise of psychology is going to be super important. And I think all of this comes back to what do our clients really need? And despite all the technology, and there's lots of DIY and there's lots of things people can do, I strongly believe that there's going to be a large subset of clients that are still going to value personal relationships more than ever. So the pandemic really showed us the importance of having your tribe. Where do you go? Whether it's your, this is beyond financial services, who cuts your hair, who's your doctor, who do you go to for advice? So people still are going to value that personal relationship. And I think what will happen is that scale is going to become more and more of the challenge. And there's a lot I can say about that. I'll try to wrap up that answer.
Yeah, I mean, you just touched on 5 or 6 different subtopics we've had in next podcast interviews and our research that we've done with Pershing this year. You mentioned even just psychology, right? We've talked with firms that have brought wealth psychologists into their businesses, right? Largely because we see some of the larger firms turning into these sort of intergenerational wealth managers, right? As opposed to just wealth managers. And that to me really does feel like one of the areas of opportunity for the more sophisticated firms, right? And I am curious just to get your take on that, because it was one of the findings that came out of a survey that we did earlier in the year when we asked where the most growth opportunities exist or in the business now relative to where the most growth opportunities will exist in 5 to 10 years. Retirement income was at the top of the list in terms of future growth, right? And then intergenerational wealth, planning, right, was number two. And intergenerational wealth didn't even rank in the top 10, right? In terms of like the current services that are presenting growth opportunities and value. Curious, why do you think that is? And what does it actually mean in your view to be a true intergenerational wealth manager?
You've got to be a really great listener, and you've really got to hear what people are saying and then maybe not saying. And this has not changed, by the way. This is something that I know I focused on probably my entire career, but I think it's never been as acute of a need because I think we as a culture have lost a lot of our interpersonal skills. Because it's easier to text someone to break up with them, or it's easier to, I'm not even sure if I can even mention email, which by sounding like a real square, people still use email, but, communication is there's a million social media outlets. And I think we as a people have really lost our ability to connect. So if you're an advisor, even touching this space, you may be an accountant, an attorney, you may be, a wealth advisor. But if you can establish and really hone your interpersonal skills, which by the way, involves a lot of what I call ego subordination. It's not about you, it's about them. And if you can dial the conversation so it's 90% about the person you're connecting with, and really focus on asking good questions and really listening, and then documenting it, in a good CRM so that the next person who comes along who might be touching your client, and maybe someone on your staff, doesn't have to go through the whole story about the divorce and the parents and all that, because they're already going to see all that right there, and they're going to have kind of a running start. So I really believe it gets back to a lot of basic blocking and tackling, finding that connection with an individual person, letting them know you really care about them. And then you can bring in all the cool stuff. Hey, this is how we're managing our portfolios, and this is how you're going to, view your accounts electronically in 5 different ways. But if you don't have that personal connection, I promise you that person, that they're just going to leave you for the next, someone that comes along with a little bit more sizzle, or someone who comes along who's a better listener.
Yeah, I love the way you summarize that, and listening to you, it's funny to even think that the term rainmaker was basically an actual title, right? At a lot of wealth management firms 10, 20 years ago. And now we're talking about ego subordination, right? So it seems like we've made, in some cases, a lot of progress in a very short period of time.
I'd like to think so, but I'm not sure.
Still more room to run, obviously. But I love the way that you've just kind of talked about the importance, obviously, of personal connections. And you mentioned, being a really good listener. And that actually leads to my next question is, I know the needs of clients will drive a lot of the way wealth managers look to hire, look to structure, and look to support, their clients. But in addition to being really good listeners, I'm curious, what types of skill sets do you think will be more and more important, right? And specifically when you're looking to hire people for your firm, what types of skill sets are you looking for and do you value most?
Anybody who's giving advice in this business has got to be very clear what they stand for. So I tell the other advisors at Dakota, look, we have a umbrella brand, and this is what the brand stands for. But your clients are probably not here because of that umbrella. They're here because of what you stand for. So maybe you're really working on advising and protecting women who've gone through a divorce, for example. That's something that you stand for. And you're going to keep growing that. Maybe you stand for helping business owners do transactions, or maybe you stand for really being an expert on estate planning and connecting with the attorney and making sure that everything is in line for that next generation. But you've got to stand for something, and it's hard to stand for more than 2 or 3 things. Probably 1 or 2 is the number. And so I really look for people who can articulate what really is their value proposition. Like, I have never really been good at coming up with an elevator speech. I don't have one. Please don't ask me to give you one, because I really don't have one. but I can tell you what I stand for. I can tell you what's important to me. For example, financial literacy for women is very, very important to me. Bringing young people, both genders or many, any gender, into the business is something that's very important to me. And all the other stuff is like a subset of those two things. But I can promise you that a lot of my clients are with me, men and women, straight and gay, because they know what I stand for and they know what kind of experience they're going to get when they're working with me and my team. And I think a lot of times people are afraid to articulate that, or they're afraid to say, hey, you know what? I really don't work with people that want what you want. I'm going to give you a name of someone else. They just take anything that shows up on their doorstep. And if you're discriminating and you know what you stand for, that will naturally lead you to what kind of clients you want. And someone said this to me recently, and I'm going to steal it and use it as my own. They said, no is a complete sentence. So the things that you're going to be saying no to are going to allow you the abundance of saying yes to the other things that are going to be more important.
Yeah, I think I agree. No is a complete sentence. It's one of my favorite sentences, by the way. It's not easy to say, but it's important. And I think just this idea of, I asked a question about skills, and when you think about recruiting, so often you hear people talking about the ability to multitask, and like it just becomes about the rote and mechanical sort of things that they can produce or execute or contribute. And I like the idea of encouraging people to think about what they stand for, and more importantly, that allows people to really get to be their truest self, right? And feel like that's okay to bring that into work every day. And in fact, it's actually an asset and it's preferred. So I know there are not a lot of other people that are saying that, and a lot of other firms that are encouraging that. So congratulations and thank you for bringing that up here on the podcast. I think it's incredibly helpful. And I did ask about skill sets. I didn't ask about specific roles, but I am curious to get your take when you look out at the next 5 to 10 years. We started at the outset of the interview talking about your role being new within Dakota, but also a role that is becoming more and more popular throughout the industry at some of the larger firms. Are there specific roles that you're starting to see more firms create? Perhaps you're adding them at Dakota or thinking about adding them that you think will be much more common over the next 5 to 10 years throughout the industry?
I'm not sure that I see, actual new positions, Mark, but what I would say is that I see a changing mindset to what people's roles are. So, for example, maybe someone started out in a chief compliance role, but they're really good at operations. Well, you know what? It's okay to move that person around and let them grow, versus being really rigid. Hey, this is what we hired you for. This is what we need you to do. And I think it's also important in roles for people to feel safe to make mistakes, and to try new things and to ask a lot of questions. We used to say there are no dumb questions, and I absolutely believe that. But let's let people fail at things. Let's let people try new things. And I think this is all part of leadership constantly reevaluating roles, training needs, modeling behavior, exposing others to different opportunities. The role of leaders today in wealth management, it's hard, man. You got to keep evolving and changing, and things are happening faster and faster. But I think you've got to continue to challenge yourself. You've got to have really constant feedback with all of your key people, and really looking at, are people happy? Are people where they want to be? Do they have enough training? Have you been transparent enough? Are they safe, in a safe place, so that if they do fail, they're not going to, it's not going to ruin the company. It's a safe fail because they know that you have their back. If I believe that if leadership can do these things, that's going to create a sustainable firm. And that's what's going to take the firm into the next, 5 or 10 years. Like, quite honestly, 5 or 10 years is so far out, Mark, that I think more like in 1 to 3 years, because the pace of change is become so exponential.
No, and that I agree. And I think that's really good context. And I think we saw in our research, I know that the majority of firms have been actively hiring and are looking to add new positions over the next 5 years. They're actively actually looking to add new positions. I think 50+% are looking to add at least one new role in 2023. And when you layer that across, the thousands of independent firms that are out there, it's really encouraging, right? It suggests that the industry is obviously in growth mode, not just in terms of assets, right, but in terms of career opportunity. And that actually brings me to my final set of questions here. You talked about diversity and inclusion a little bit earlier, and we can do an entire podcast episode or maybe even series on this. But as more and more firms look to add talent, and the new positions tend to be power planners, client service associates, so more junior positions. I'm curious, what role you think diversity and inclusion will play in reshaping the wealth management industry and potentially accelerating the growth of the industry.
Well, I think diversity and inclusion are already having a big impact on both sides. So client-wise, I think, again, advice is being normalized for all people of all colors and backgrounds. And that just naturally, hugely expands the pool of clients and potential clients. And then on the profession side of things, there are so many absolutely fantastic, innovative initiatives going on right now to increase awareness of wealth management, financial planning as a career path. And I think CFP board, Camilla, Kate, they're just doing a fantastic job. Another thing that's happening and I know, Mark, you and your organization have been involved with too, is awards. Mm-hmm. Because when someone sees, wow, a woman sees a woman on stage, or an African-American person sees someone that looks like them on stage getting an award, they're like, wow, that could be me. I didn't even know that I would qualify for that, or I'd be even considered. So there's lots and lots of intense movement happening in this space. And I really believe in 2 or 3 years, the space is going to look a lot different. Up until now, up until about a year ago, I was very frustrated with CFP board statistics on diversity in the business, as measured by CFPs. Mm-hmm. But I think we're going to see a real acceleration in the next few years. And hopefully when we're talking in 2 or 3 years, we're going to have a lot of good news to talk about.
Yeah, I agree. And I had a similar, CFP has great statistics, right? So you can actually see gender, the sort of classic 80-20 split, right? Maybe even lower, and just in terms of male to female advisors. The needle started to move, and it happened slowly, but it seems like the pandemic opened up some new opportunities, right? You didn't just have to recruit in your local market, right? You can pretty much recruit, attract talent, and integrate people into your business from just about anywhere. And especially if that happens in conjunction with the numbers I mentioned before, right? The large numbers of companies that are looking to hire new people. There really can be, a lot of progress that is made in a short period of time. So I'm glad that we're having a similar experience. And hopefully, we don't have to wait 2 or 3 years. And when we do this interview in a year to kick off 2024, we'll continue to see some progress. Carina, before we wrap up here, was there anything more specific? I think we've covered a lot of ground, and I really appreciate you giving a very different perspective on what can drive growth and success, right? It's not always just a purely sort of quantitative view, right? There are a lot of other, more human things that I think our audience needs to consider. But is there any sort of final piece of advice that you'd leave for our listeners here as they think about maybe restructuring, redesigning, their firm, that would be important for the leader of an advisory firm to take into consideration?
I would encourage leaders to really drill down and disperse the idea of taking responsibility for growth. Growth is everybody's responsibility. And so the leader can set direction, provide resources, pat people on the back, but everybody, all of us, all of your listeners, anyone in this business has a role to play. And I would also say that everyone has a role to play in terms of sustainability. So is the growth being sustained? Does it mean that you make that extra phone call to get somebody in as an intern? Does it mean that you take somebody to lunch to give them a little bit of coaching? Everybody has a role to play. It's not just on the stated leaders. And I think if everybody would take that responsibility and do one thing towards growth, towards DEI, towards sustainability, I think when we talk next year, we're going to have big smiles on our faces.
I appreciate that. And just like you stole the line, no is a complete sentence, I think I'm going to steal growth is everyone's responsibility from you. So thank you.
My pleasure.
All right, Carina, thank you so much for stopping by the next podcast. I really do appreciate it. I learn something every time we talk, genuinely, and I learned a tremendous amount here today. So thank you for being generous with your time and your thoughts. And thank you for contributing to this next podcast and project, which will continue to build out and deliver to the wealth management audience in 2023. So on behalf of the wealth management team here at Informa and on behalf of the entire next project and team, thank you everybody for stopping by. Thank you, Carina, again for joining us on the podcast. And we look forward to having everyone back on the next episode of the next podcast real soon. Thanks, everyone.